The morning mist clung to the Mississippi River like a shroud as Thomas Whitmore guided his horse-drawn carriage down the long avenue of ancient oak trees. Each massive trunk stood sentinel, their gnarled branches forming a cathedral of green that filtered the Louisiana sun into dancing patterns of light and shadow. It was September 1851, and Thomas had traveled from New Orleans to investigate disturbing rumors that had reached the ears of certain influential families in the city. As a journalist for the New Orleans Daily Picayune, Thomas had built his reputation on exposing the uncomfortable truths that polite society preferred to ignore. The whispers about Oak Alley Plantation had been growing louder in the coffee houses and drawing rooms of the French Quarter, stories that made even hardened men lower their voices and glance nervously over their shoulders. The plantation house emerged from behind the oaks like a vision from a fever dream. Its Greek Revival columns gleamed white in the humid air, and the wide galleries promised cool refuge from the oppressive heat. Yet something about the perfection of it all unsettled Thomas. Perhaps it was the unnatural silence that seemed to emanate from the slave quarters, or the way the Spanish moss hung motionless despite the river breeze. Jacques Boudreau, the plantation's overseer, met Thomas at the front steps. A lean man with calculating eyes and hands that bore the calluses of violence, Jacques had the look of someone who had learned to profit from others' suffering. His smile was practiced, but it never reached his eyes. "Monsieur Whitmore," Jacques said in his thick Creole accent, extending a hand that Thomas reluctantly shook. "Master Roman is expecting you. He's most eager to show you the hospitality that Oak Alley is known for." As they walked through the grand foyer, Thomas noticed the portraits lining the walls, generations of the Roman family, their eyes seeming to follow his movement. The current master, Lucien Roman, was a man in his 50s whose wealth had been built on sugar and secrets. His wife, Céleste, had died under mysterious circumstances 3 years prior, leaving behind only whispered speculation about her final days. "The master has prepared special accommodations for your stay," Jacques continued, leading Thomas up the curved staircase. "He believes a man of your talents will appreciate the unique customs we maintain here." Through the tall windows, Thomas caught glimpses of the slave quarters, a collection of weathered cabins that seemed to huddle together in the shadow of the great house. Even from this distance, he could sense an atmosphere of fear that hung over them like a physical presence. The few enslaved people he could see moved with the careful deliberation of those who knew they were always being watched. That evening, as Thomas sat on the gallery sipping bourbon that burned like liquid fire, he began to understand why the stories about Oak Alley had spread beyond the plantation's borders. The very air seemed thick with secrets, and the Spanish moss swayed in patterns that suggested hidden watchers in the darkness beyond the torchlight. Lucien Roman joined him as the sun disappeared behind the river, his presence announced by the soft click of expensive boots on the wooden planks. The master of Oak Alley was a man who wore his power like a well-tailored coat, comfortable, but always visible to those who knew how to look. "Monsieur Whitmore," Lucien said, settling into a chair beside his guest, "I trust Jacques has made you comfortable. We pride ourselves on hospitality here at Oak Alley." The way he emphasized certain words made Thomas's skin crawl, but he maintained his professional composure. "Your home is magnificent, Monsieur Roman. I can see why it's spoken of so highly in New Orleans." Lucien's laugh was soft, but carried an edge that made Thomas think of a blade being drawn slowly from its sheath. "Ah, but I suspect you've heard more than just praise for our architecture. The city has such an appetite for stories." As if summoned by some invisible signal, a young enslaved woman appeared with a tray of refreshments. Thomas noticed how she kept her eyes downcast, how her hands trembled slightly as she served them, and how quickly she disappeared back into the shadows of the house. There was something in her manner that spoke of a fear deeper than the usual terror of plantation life. "Tell me, Monsieur Roman," Thomas said carefully, "what makes Oak Alley different from other plantations in the region?" Lucien's smile in the lamplight was predatory. "We maintain certain traditions that have been passed down through generations, customs that ensure the proper order of things. Perhaps tomorrow you'll have the opportunity to witness some of our evening activities." The way he said activities made Thomas's blood run cold, but he forced himself to nod with apparent interest. As the night deepened around them, he began to understand that his investigation would require more courage than he had initially anticipated. The stories that had brought him to Oak Alley were not mere gossip, they were warnings. In the distance, barely audible above the sound of the river, Thomas thought he heard something that made his heart race. The sound of crying, quickly muffled, coming from the direction of the slave quarters. When he glanced at Lucienne, the man was watching him with the patient intensity of a cat studying a mouse. "The night can play tricks on a man's hearing," Lucienne said softly, "especially when he's not accustomed to our Louisiana evenings. Perhaps you should retire, Monsieur Whitmore. Tomorrow will be illuminating." Thomas spent a restless night in the opulent guest room, his sleep broken by sounds that seemed to drift through the walls like whispers from another world. When dawn finally broke over the Mississippi, he found himself drawn to the window that overlooked the slave quarters. What he saw there made his stomach turn. A group of enslaved women were being led from their cabins by Jacques and two other white men Thomas didn't recognize. The women moved with the mechanical obedience of those who had learned that resistance brought only greater suffering. But it was their destination that filled Thomas with dread, a large barn that stood apart from the other buildings, its windows painted black from the inside. At breakfast, Lucien appeared refreshed and cheerful, as if the previous night's ominous conversation had never occurred. He spoke casually about the weather, the sugar harvest, and the social events planned for the coming season in New Orleans. Yet Thomas noticed how the enslaved people who served them moved with even greater caution than before, their eyes holding a haunted quality that spoke of recent trauma. "I thought you might be interested in touring our facilities today," Lucien said as he buttered his biscuit with deliberate precision. "We've developed some rather innovative approaches to maintaining discipline and productivity." Thomas forced himself to show interest, though every instinct screamed at him to flee this place immediately. "I would be honored to see how Oak Alley operates." The tour began innocuously enough. The sugar mill, the fields where enslaved workers toiled under the merciless sun, the stables where magnificent horses were bred and trained. But as the day progressed, Thomas began to notice details that painted a darker picture. The way certain cabins were set apart from others, marked with symbols carved into their door frames, the presence of chains and restraints in buildings that supposedly housed agricultural equipment. The careful way Jacques avoided certain areas while maintaining a running commentary about plantation efficiency. It was late afternoon when they approached the black-windowed barn Thomas had observed that morning. Lucien paused at its entrance, his hand resting on the heavy wooden door with an almost reverent touch. "This," he said quietly, "is where we conduct our most important work. The preservation of natural order, you might say." Inside, the barn had been transformed into something that defied easy description. The agricultural equipment had been replaced with furniture that seemed designed for restraint rather than comfort. Chains hung from the rafters, and the walls bore stains that Thomas preferred not to identify. The air was thick with the smell of fear, sweat, and something else, something that made his throat close with revulsion. "You see, Monsieur Whitmore," Lucien continued, his voice taking on the tone of a professor delivering a lecture, "the natural order requires constant reinforcement. The inferior must be reminded of their place, not just through labor, but through more intimate demonstrations of power. Jacques appeared from the shadows, leading a young enslaved woman Thomas recognized from the previous evening's service. Her name was Celeste, named with cruel irony after Lucien's deceased wife. She couldn't have been more than 18, and the terror in her eyes was so profound that Thomas felt physically ill. The evening ceremonies, Lucien explained with clinical detachment, serve multiple purposes. They reinforce hierarchy, provide entertainment for myself and my associates, and ensure that word of our methods spreads throughout the quarters as a deterrent to disobedience. Thomas watched in horror as Jacques began to prepare restraints, his movements practiced and efficient. Other men began to arrive, overseers from neighboring plantations, local officials, even a few faces Thomas recognized from New Orleans society. They gathered with the casual air of men attending a social function, their conversations peppered with laughter and anticipation. I should return to the house," Thomas managed to say, his voice barely steady. Lucien's hand fell on his shoulder with deceptive gentleness. "Nonsense. You came here seeking the truth about Oak Alley, did you not? This is our truth, Monsieur Whitmore. This is how we maintain the natural order that allows civilization to flourish." As the sun set behind the oak trees, Thomas found himself trapped in a nightmare that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The ceremony that followed was a systematic degradation designed not just to break the spirit of its victims, but to bind the participants together in shared complicity. What happened in that barn was not merely abuse. It was a ritual of power that transformed human beings into objects for the entertainment of monsters. The sounds that emerged from the barn that night, screams, laughter, and worse, carried across the plantation like a plague wind. In the slave quarters, families huddled together in their cabins, knowing that any one of them might be chosen next. The system Lucien had created was not just about individual cruelty, it was about creating an atmosphere of terror so complete that resistance became unthinkable. Thomas emerged from the barn hours later, his clothes disheveled and his soul permanently stained by what he had witnessed. He had not participated, Lucien had been content to let him observe, but his inaction felt like a form of complicity that would torment him forever. "You understand now," Lucien said as they walked back toward the house under a canopy of stars that seemed to mock the horrors below. "This is why Oak Alley prospers when other plantations struggle with rebellion and unrest. Fear, properly applied, is more effective than any chain." The third day at Oak Alley brought with it a revelation that made Thomas understand the true scope of what he had stumbled upon. What he had initially assumed was the isolated depravity of one man proved to be something far more sinister, a network of corruption that extended deep into Louisiana society. Dr. Armand Thibodeau arrived that morning in an elegant carriage bearing the seal of the New Orleans Medical College. A distinguished gentleman in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes, he seemed utterly out of place in the moral wasteland of Oak Alley. Yet as Thomas observed the doctor's interactions with Lucien, he began to understand that appearances could be devastatingly deceiving. "Ah, Dr. Thibodeau," Lucien greeted the newcomer with genuine warmth. "I trust you've brought the supplies we discussed." The doctor's medical bag clinked softly as he set it down, and Thomas caught a glimpse of bottles and instruments that seemed to have nothing to do with healing. "Everything you requested, mon ami. The new compound should prove quite effective in maintaining compliance." Thomas felt his blood turn to ice as he realized what he was witnessing. The doctor was not here to treat the enslaved people of Oak Alley. He was here to drug them, to make them more pliable for the horrors that awaited them in the barn. "Monsieur Whitmore," Dr. Thibodeau said, turning his attention to the journalist with a smile that never wavered. "Lucien tells me you're documenting the innovative practices we've developed here. How refreshing to meet a man of letters who appreciates the necessity of progress." The conversation that followed revealed the existence of what they called the circle, a group of influential men throughout Louisiana who shared Lucian's twisted philosophy and participated in similar practices on their own properties. Plantation owners, doctors, lawyers, judges, and even clergy had formed a secret society dedicated to what they termed the preservation of natural hierarchy through intimate correction. Judge Beauregard Fontenot arrived next, his judicial robes replaced by the casual attire of a man on holiday. Thomas recognized him from the New Orleans courthouse, where he was known for his harsh sentences against enslaved people who dared to resist their masters. Now Thomas understood the source of that harshness. It was not mere legal severity, but personal sadism dressed in the robes of justice. "The beauty of our system," Judge Fontenot explained as they sat on the gallery drinking mint juleps, "is its self-reinforcing nature. The fear we create here spreads far beyond these grounds. Every enslaved person in Louisiana has heard whispers of Oak Alley, and that fear keeps them compliant even on plantations where such direct methods are not employed." Father Matthias Boudreau, Jacques' brother and a priest from a nearby parish, completed the day's gathering of distinguished visitors. His presence was perhaps the most disturbing of all, as he brought with him the twisted theology that justified their actions. In his sermons, he preached that the suffering of the enslaved was divinely ordained, and that their masters were merely instruments of God's will. "The scriptures are quite clear," Father Boudreau intoned, with the same voice he used to deliver Sunday sermons. "Some are born to rule, others to serve. Our evening activities merely reinforce the divine order that God Himself has established." As Thomas listened to these men discuss their crimes with the casual air of a book club, he began to understand the true horror of what he had discovered. This was not the work of isolated madmen, but of a sophisticated network that had corrupted every level of society. They had lawyers to protect them, judges to absolve them, doctors to enable them, and priests to sanctify their actions. The afternoon brought a tour of what Lucien proudly called his breeding program. In a series of cabins set apart from the main quarters, young enslaved women were kept in conditions that made Thomas's earlier revulsion seem mild by comparison. These women existed solely for the production of children who would be raised from birth to accept their degradation as natural and inevitable. "You see," Dr. Thibodeau explained with clinical detachment, "we've discovered that trauma experienced in early childhood creates a more compliant adult. These children will never know rebellion because they will never know that resistance is possible." The women in these cabins moved like ghosts, their spirits so thoroughly broken that they seemed barely human. Some held infants who would never know freedom, never know love, never know anything but the systematic destruction of their humanity. Thomas watched a young mother try to comfort her crying baby, and the hopeless tenderness in her eyes nearly broke his heart. That evening's ceremony was even more elaborate than the previous nights, with the visiting dignitaries taking active roles in the proceedings. Thomas was forced to watch as these pillars of Louisiana society revealed their true nature, their civilized facades dropping away to expose the monsters beneath. Judge Fontenot proved to be particularly creative in his cruelty, using his knowledge of the law to devise punishments that technically fell within legal boundaries while maximizing psychological damage. Dr. Thibodeau administered drugs that heightened sensitivity to pain while preventing unconsciousness, ensuring that victims remained aware throughout their ordeal. Father Boudreau provided a running commentary that framed each act of violence as a religious sacrament. "You must understand," Lucien said to Thomas, as they watched the proceedings, "this is not mere entertainment. This is statecraft. This is how we maintain the order that allows our civilization to flourish. Every scream you hear tonight prevents 100 rebellions tomorrow. As the night wore on, Thomas began to understand that he was not merely witnessing isolated acts of cruelty, but a systematic program designed to destroy the human spirit so completely that resistance became literally unthinkable. The Circle had not just discovered how to break people, they had perfected the art of breaking entire generations. The fourth day dawned gray and oppressive, with storm clouds gathering over the Mississippi like an omen of the revelations to come. Thomas had spent another sleepless night, his mind reeling from the horrors he had witnessed and the growing realization that he was trapped in a web far more complex and dangerous than he had imagined. At breakfast, Lucian's demeanor had shifted subtly. The genial host was gone, replaced by something colder and more calculating. He studied Thomas with the intensity of a man making a final assessment, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of an ultimatum. "I trust your stay has been educational, Monsieur Whitmore," Lucian said, his voice carrying a new edge. "The question now is what you intend to do with the knowledge you've gained." Thomas set down his coffee cup with hands that trembled slightly. "I came here as a journalist, Monsieur Roman. My obligation is to report the truth." Lucian's laugh was soft, but utterly without humor. The truth? And what truth would that be? The word of a single journalist against the testimony of a judge, a doctor, a priest, and some of the most respected families in Louisiana. Who do you think the world will believe? The implications of Lucien's words settled over Thomas like a shroud. He was not just dealing with individual criminals, but with a conspiracy that reached into every level of society. These men had the power to destroy him professionally, legally, and physically if he threatened their secret. Jacques appeared in the doorway, his presence no longer that of a simple overseer, but of an enforcer. Behind him stood two other men Thomas hadn't seen before, hard-faced individuals whose very presence spoke of violence barely held in check. "You see," Lucien continued, "we've had visitors before, curious individuals who thought they could expose our little community. Some were journalists like yourself, others were abolitionists, government officials, even a few misguided clergy who thought they could reform us." Thomas felt his throat go dry. What happened to them? "Oh, they're still here," Lucien said with a smile that made Thomas's blood freeze. "In a manner of speaking, would you like to meet them?" The tour that followed was a descent into a hell that Thomas had not imagined possible. Beneath the main house, accessible through a hidden entrance in the wine cellar, lay a network of chambers that served as both prison and torture facility. Here, those who had threatened to expose the Circle were kept in conditions that made the treatment of the enslaved people above seem merciful by comparison. In the first cell, Thomas found the remains of what had once been a man, a former journalist from the Baltimore Sun, who had come to investigate rumors of plantation atrocities 2 years earlier. The creature that looked up at them bore little resemblance to anything human, its mind so thoroughly shattered that it could only whimper and cower when the light hit its eyes. "Poor Marcus," Lucien said with mock sympathy. He was so determined to tell his story. Now he can barely remember his own name. Dr. Thibodeau's pharmaceutical experiments have proven quite effective in reshaping the human mind. Other cells held other victims, a federal marshal who had gotten too close to the truth, an abolitionist preacher whose congregation still believed he had died in a carriage accident, a young woman from a prominent New Orleans family who had threatened to expose her father's involvement in the Circle. All had been reduced to broken shells, their minds destroyed by a combination of drugs, torture, and psychological manipulation. "You see the choice before you," Lucien said as they climbed back to the main floor. "You can join us, become part of the Circle and share in its considerable benefits, or you can join our guests below. There is no third option." The rest of the day passed in a haze of horror as Thomas was shown the full extent of the Circle's operations. They had safe houses throughout Louisiana and Mississippi, a network of corrupt officials who provided protection and financial interests that extended far beyond the plantation system. They trafficked in human misery on an industrial scale, supplying victims to wealthy clients throughout the South and even to certain establishments in New Orleans that catered to the most depraved tastes. Dr. Thibodeau took particular pleasure in explaining his research into what he called behavioral modification through trauma. He had developed techniques for breaking the human spirit that were far more sophisticated than simple physical torture. His methods could reduce a strong-willed adult to a compliant shell in a matter of weeks, and the effects were permanent. The beauty of our approach, the doctor explained as he showed Thomas his laboratory, is that we don't simply destroy, we rebuild. We create new personalities, new loyalties, new purposes. Our subjects don't just obey us, they love us for the privilege of serving. Judge Fontenot demonstrated the legal framework that protected the circle's activities. Through careful manipulation of property laws, medical regulations, and criminal statutes, they had created a system where their victims had no legal recourse, and their crimes were technically within the bounds of the law. Slavery itself provides the perfect cover, the judge explained with obvious pride. When human beings are legally property, almost anything done to them can be justified as property management. And when the victims are already considered less than human by society, who will believe their testimony against ours? Father Boudreau's contribution was perhaps the most insidious of all. He had developed a theology that not only justified their actions, but made them seem virtuous. In his twisted interpretation of Scripture, the suffering they inflicted was a form of divine service, and their victims were blessed to participate in God's plan for maintaining social order. "We are not monsters," the priest insisted with genuine conviction. "We are shepherds, guiding our flock according to divine will. The pain we inflict is temporary, but the order we maintain is eternal." As evening approached, Thomas found himself faced with the most terrible decision of his life. He could join the circle, become complicit in their crimes, and live with the knowledge that his silence enabled continued atrocities. Or he could refuse and face a fate worse than death in the chambers beneath Oak Alley. The ceremony that night was different from the previous ones. This time, Thomas was not merely an observer, but the guest of honor. The other members of the circle watched him with the expectant air of men awaiting a decision that would determine not just his fate, but theirs as well. "Choose wisely, Monsieur Whitmore," Lucian said, as the evening's horrors began to unfold around them. "Your next words will determine whether you leave Oak Alley as a brother or whether you never leave at all." Thomas's decision came not as a moment of clarity, but as a gradual surrender to the impossible reality of his situation. Faced with the choice between complicity and destruction, he chose survival, though the word felt like ash in his mouth as he spoke it. I understand the necessity of what you do here," he said, the words feeling like poison on his tongue. "Perhaps there is a place for me in your organization." Lucian's smile was triumphant, but Thomas could see the calculation behind it. This was not acceptance. It was the beginning of a more subtle form of imprisonment. He would be watched, tested, and gradually drawn deeper into the circle's web until escape became impossible. The initiation that followed was designed to ensure Thomas's permanent complicity. He was forced to participate in acts that would make him as guilty as the rest of them, creating a web of mutual blackmail that bound the circle together. By dawn, Thomas Whitmore, the journalist, was dead, replaced by something darker and more broken. Over the following weeks, Thomas learned the true scope of the circle's influence. Their network extended far beyond Louisiana, reaching into Mississippi, Alabama, and even into the halls of power in Washington. They had allies in Congress, supporters in the military, and financial backing from some of the wealthiest families in America. The plantation system, Thomas discovered, was merely the visible tip of a vast iceberg of human trafficking and exploitation. The Circle operated a sophisticated network that moved victims between plantations, private residences, and specialized facilities designed for the entertainment of their wealthy clients. They had perfected the art of making people disappear, whether they were enslaved individuals who had outlived their usefulness or free citizens who had become inconvenient. Dr. Thibodeau's research had expanded beyond simple behavioral modification. He was now experimenting with techniques for creating what he called perfect slaves, individuals whose personalities had been so thoroughly reconstructed that they felt genuine gratitude for their enslavement. These subjects were highly prized by Circle members and commanded enormous prices when sold to private collectors. The future of human management, the doctor explained during one of his lectures, lies not in chains and whips, but in the careful reconstruction of the human psyche. Why force compliance when you can create genuine devotion? Judge Fontenot had been equally busy, working to expand the legal framework that protected the Circle's activities. He had drafted legislation that would make it even easier to classify free blacks as escaped slaves, effectively allowing the Circle to kidnap and enslave anyone they chose. His connections in the legislature made passage of these laws almost certain. The beauty of the law, the judge explained, is its flexibility. With the right interpretation, almost any action can be made legal and almost any person can be made property. Father Boudreau's theological innovations had found a receptive audience among certain segments of the clergy. His sermons about divine hierarchy and the sanctity of suffering had been adopted by ministers throughout the South, creating a religious justification for the Circle's activities that made resistance seem not just futile, but sinful. "We are creating a new Christianity," the priest declared with fervent conviction, one that recognizes the divine order and embraces the necessity of suffering in maintaining God's plan. Thomas found himself assigned to what Lucian called recruitment and documentation. His job was to identify potential new members for the Circle and to maintain detailed records of their activities. The work required him to travel throughout the South, visiting plantations and private residences where the Circle's influence was spreading. In Mississippi, he met Colonel Jefferson Davis, a plantation owner whose methods made even Lucian seem restrained. Davis had turned his entire plantation into a laboratory for human experimentation, testing new techniques for breaking the human spirit and rebuilding it according to his specifications. His success rate was so high that other Circle members sent their most difficult subjects to him for correction. In Alabama, Thomas encountered the Reverend Dr. Josiah Knott, a physician and minister who had combined the Circle's techniques with his own theories about racial hierarchy. Knott had developed what he called scientific slavery, a system that used medical and psychological techniques to prove the inherent inferiority of enslaved people while simultaneously creating that inferiority through systematic abuse. "We are not merely maintaining the natural order," Knott explained during Thomas's visit. "We are perfecting it. Through careful application of scientific principles, we can create a race of beings who are genuinely suited for nothing but servitude." In Georgia, the Circle had established what they called training facilities, specialized institutions where enslaved people were prepared for specific roles in their network. Some were trained as domestic servants for Circle members' homes, others as entertainers for their private gatherings, and still others as enforcers who could be trusted to maintain discipline without supervision. The most disturbing facility Thomas visited was in South Carolina, where the Circle had established what they euphemistically called a breeding program. Here, enslaved women were subjected to systematic rape designed to produce children with specific characteristics. The resulting offspring were raised from birth according to Circle principles, creating a generation that had never known anything but absolute submission. These children, explained the facility's director, a former medical professor named Dr. Samuel Cartwright, represent the future of human management. They have been shaped from birth to accept their place in the natural order. They will never rebel because they will never conceive of rebellion as possible. As Thomas traveled and documented these horrors, he began to understand that the Circle was not just a criminal organization. It was a cancer that was metastasizing throughout American society. Their influence was growing, their techniques were being refined, and their vision of a perfectly ordered society built on systematic human degradation was becoming reality. The most chilling aspect of his travels was the discovery that the Circle's influence extended beyond the plantation system. In New Orleans, he found that they had infiltrated the city's most exclusive brothels, providing specialty services to wealthy clients who shared their tastes. In Mobile, they had established connections with the international slave trade, importing victims from Africa and the Caribbean for their specialized facilities. In Charleston, Thomas discovered that the Circle had formed alliances with similar organizations in other countries. They were exchanging techniques with slave traders in Brazil, sharing research with colonial administrators in the Caribbean, and even establishing connections with certain elements in European society who shared their philosophy. "We are part of a global movement," Louisiana explained during one of their regular correspondence sessions. "The principles we have developed here at Oak Alley are being applied throughout the world. We are creating a new form of civilization, one based on the scientific management of human resources." By the end of his first year with the Circle, Thomas had documented a network of horror that spanned the entire South and reached into every level of society. He had seen techniques for breaking the human spirit that were more sophisticated than anything he had imagined possible, and he had watched as these techniques were refined and spread to new locations. The journalist in him wanted to expose what he had learned, but the broken man he had become knew that such exposure was impossible. The Circle's influence was too vast, their protection too complete, and their methods too effective. Anyone who tried to oppose them would simply disappear, becoming another victim in their underground chambers. As he sat in his room at Oak Alley, writing his reports by lamplight, Thomas realized that he had become something he had never thought possible: a chronicler of evil, a documentarian of human degradation, a willing participant in the systematic destruction of everything he had once believed in. The worst part was that he was beginning to understand their logic, to see the efficiency of their methods, to appreciate the elegance of their system. The Circle had not just broken his body and spirit, they had begun to remake his mind in their own image. 2 years had passed since Thomas first arrived at Oak Alley, and the man who now bore his name was barely recognizable as the idealistic journalist who had once sought to expose injustice. The Circle's methods of psychological reconstruction had proven as effective on him as on any of their other subjects, though his transformation had been more gradual and subtle. Thomas now served as the Circle's chief chronicler and strategist, his journalistic skills perverted into documenting their successes and planning their expansion. His reports were masterpieces of clinical detachment, describing the systematic destruction of human beings with the same dispassionate tone he had once used to cover political events. The network had grown exponentially under his documentation. What had begun as a loose association of like-minded plantation owners had evolved into a sophisticated organization with cells throughout the South and connections reaching into the highest levels of government. They now operated with the efficiency of a business and the reach of a government agency. Dr. Thibodeau's research had achieved breakthrough after breakthrough. His latest innovation was what he called selective memory reconstruction, a technique that allowed them to erase specific memories while leaving others intact. Victims could be made to forget their previous lives entirely, while retaining the skills and knowledge that made them useful to the circle. "We can now create perfect servants," the doctor explained during a presentation to circle leadership. "Individuals who possess all the capabilities we require, but none of the psychological resistance that comes from remembering freedom. They serve us not from fear, but from genuine love and gratitude." The technique had been tested on several subjects, including some of the prisoners from the underground chambers. The results were so successful that the circle had begun offering the service to wealthy clients throughout the Americas. For the right price, they could transform any troublesome slave, rebellious servant, or inconvenient family member into a perfectly compliant tool. Judge Fontenot's legal innovations had been equally successful. Through careful manipulation of state and federal legislation, he had created a legal framework that made the circle's activities not just permissible, but officially sanctioned. His Fugitive Slave Enhancement Act had passed through several state legislatures, giving circle members the legal authority to detain and correct any person of color they suspected of being an escaped slave. "The beauty of the law," Fontenot explained to Thomas during one of their planning sessions, "is that it can be made to serve any purpose. We have essentially legalized kidnapping as long as the victims are the right color and we follow the proper procedures." Father Boudreau's theological work had found acceptance in mainstream religious circles. His book, Divine Hierarchy and Christian Duty, had become required reading in several seminaries, and his interpretation of Scripture was being preached from pulpits throughout the South. He had successfully transformed the circle's philosophy from criminal conspiracy into religious doctrine. "We have achieved something remarkable," the priest told Thomas with obvious pride. "We have made our work not just legal and profitable, but holy. Our members now serve God as well as themselves when they participate in our activities." The circle's influence had spread far beyond the plantation system. They now operated facilities in major cities throughout the South, providing services to wealthy clients who shared their tastes. In New Orleans, their private club catered to the city's elite, offering entertainment that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. In Charleston, they had established a finishing school, where the daughters of prominent families were taught the proper methods of managing human property. Thomas's role in this expansion had been crucial. His ability to identify potential recruits and assess their psychological vulnerabilities had made him invaluable to the circle's leadership. He had developed profiles of hundreds of individuals throughout the South, categorizing them as potential members, useful allies, or necessary targets for elimination. His reports had become legendary within the circle for their insight and accuracy. He could predict with remarkable precision which plantation owners would embrace their methods, which officials could be corrupted, and which potential opponents needed to be neutralized before they became threats. The most disturbing aspect of Thomas's transformation was his growing appreciation for the circle's work. He had begun to see their activities not as crimes, but as necessary functions of a well-ordered society. The systematic breaking of human spirits no longer horrified him. It impressed him with its efficiency and elegance. "You have become our greatest success," Lucian told him during one of their private conversations. "Not because you serve us from fear, but because you have come to understand the truth of what we do. You see the necessity, the beauty, the divine purpose of our work." Thomas nodded, and the agreement was genuine. He had indeed come to see the circle's activities as necessary and even beautiful. The screams that had once filled him with horror now sounded like music. The music of order being imposed on chaos, of hierarchy being properly established, of the natural law being enforced. His latest project was perhaps his most ambitious yet. Working with Dr. Thibodeau and Judge Fontenot, he was developing a comprehensive plan for the expansion of circle principles throughout the entire United States. The plan, which they called the Great Ordering, would systematically apply their techniques to every level of society, creating a perfectly hierarchical civilization where everyone knew their place and accepted it without question. Imagine, Thomas wrote in his proposal, a society where rebellion is not just impossible, but literally unthinkable, where every person serves their proper function with genuine joy and gratitude, where the chaos and disorder that plague our current system are replaced by perfect harmony and efficiency. The plan was breathtaking in its scope and ambition. It called for the gradual infiltration of every major institution in American society: schools, churches, government agencies, military units, and business organizations. Circle members would be placed in positions of authority throughout the country, and their techniques would be gradually implemented until the entire population had been properly conditioned. "We are not seeking to rule through force," Thomas explained to the Circle's Leadership Council. "We are seeking to create a society where rule is unnecessary because everyone willingly accepts their proper place. We will achieve not conquest, but conversion." The plan had received enthusiastic approval from Circle leadership, and implementation had already begun. Circle members were being placed in key positions throughout the South, and their influence was gradually spreading northward. They had established training facilities in border states, recruited allies in major cities, and begun the careful work of psychological conditioning that would eventually transform the entire nation. Thomas's role in this grand project filled him with a sense of purpose he had never experienced as a mere journalist. He was no longer simply documenting events, he was helping to shape the future of human civilization. The broken man who had once wept at the sight of suffering had been replaced by a visionary who saw that suffering as a necessary tool for creating a better world. As he worked late into the night in his study at Oak Alley, surrounded by maps, reports, and plans for the systematic reconstruction of American society, Thomas felt a deep satisfaction. He had found his true calling, his proper place in the natural order. He was no longer a victim of the Circle. He was one of its architects, helping to build a new world where such confusion and resistance would be impossible. The transformation was complete. Thomas Whitmore, the journalist who had come to Oak Alley seeking truth, was dead. In his place sat a man who had found a different kind of truth, the truth that some people were born to rule and others to serve, and that the highest calling was to ensure that this natural order was properly maintained. 5 years had passed since Thomas first arrived at Oak Alley, and the world he had helped create was beginning to take shape across the American South. The Circle's influence had spread like a carefully cultivated disease, infecting every level of society with their philosophy of systematic human degradation disguised as natural order. The plantation itself had become something far more significant than a simple agricultural operation. Oak Alley now served as the headquarters of what they called the Institute for Social Harmony, a legitimate-seeming organization that provided training, research, and consulting services to plantation owners, government officials, and business leaders throughout the region. Visitors came from across the Americas and even from Europe to study the Circle's methods. They arrived as distinguished guests, toured the facilities with academic interest, and departed with detailed manuals on human management techniques that they would implement in their own domains. The horrors that had once been hidden in the black-windowed barn were now conducted in purpose-built facilities that resembled medical colleges more than torture chambers. Dr. Ibodeau had been appointed to the faculty of 3 major universities, where he taught courses on behavioral psychology and social medicine that were really instruction in advanced techniques of human breaking and reconstruction. His textbooks were used in medical schools throughout the South, ensuring that a new generation of physicians would be trained in Circle methods. Judge Fontenot had been elevated to the state Supreme Court, where his rulings consistently expanded the legal framework that protected circle activities. His judicial opinions were cited by courts throughout the region, creating a body of case law that made systematic human abuse not just legal, but constitutionally protected. Father Boudreau had been appointed bishop of a new diocese that encompassed much of Louisiana and Mississippi. His sermons were broadcast throughout the region, and his theological writings had been adopted by the largest Protestant denominations in the South. The Circle's philosophy was now preached from thousands of pulpits every Sunday, transforming criminal conspiracy into religious doctrine. Thomas himself had achieved a position of influence that would have been unimaginable to the naive journalist who had first arrived at Oak Alley. He now served as Director of Strategic Development for the Institute, a position that gave him access to the highest levels of government and society. His reports were read by senators, his recommendations influenced policy decisions, and his vision of a perfectly ordered society was gradually becoming reality. The techniques pioneered at Oak Alley had been refined and systematized until they could be applied with industrial efficiency. The Circle now operated a network of facilities throughout the South that processed thousands of victims annually, breaking them down and rebuilding them according to specifications provided by their clients. The breeding programs had expanded beyond anything Lucian had originally envisioned. They now operated facilities in 7 states, producing children who were raised from birth to accept their degradation as natural and inevitable. These children grew up to become the perfect servants, workers, and entertainers that Circle members required, and their existence proved that human nature itself could be reshaped through proper application of scientific principles. The memory reconstruction techniques had been perfected to the point where they could selectively edit a person's entire life history. Troublesome slaves could be made to forget their families, their freedom, even their own names, while retaining the skills and knowledge that made them valuable. Free blacks could be given false memories of enslavement, making their capture and sale legally and psychologically seamless. The international connections had grown into a global network of like-minded organizations. The Circle now exchanged techniques with slave traders in Brazil, colonial administrators in the Caribbean, and certain elements in European society who shared their vision of perfect social order. They had established training facilities in Cuba, Mexico, and even in certain parts of Africa, spreading their methods throughout the Atlantic world. The political influence had reached levels that made opposition virtually impossible. Circle members now held positions in Congress, state legislatures, and federal agencies. Their philosophy had been incorporated into the platforms of major political parties, and their techniques were being used to manage not just enslaved populations, but free workers, immigrants, and anyone else who threatened the established order. Thomas's masterwork, the Great Ordering, had been implemented with remarkable success. The systematic infiltration of American institutions was proceeding ahead of schedule, and the psychological conditioning of the population was showing measurable results. Resistance to authority was declining, acceptance of hierarchy was increasing, and the chaotic individualism that had once characterized American society was being replaced by orderly compliance. The most remarkable achievement was how completely the Circle had managed to normalize their activities. What had once been hidden in underground chambers was now conducted in broad daylight, protected by law, sanctified by religion, and justified by science. The systematic destruction of human dignity had been transformed into a respectable profession, complete with academic credentials and professional associations. Visitors to Oak Alley in 1856 would have found it difficult to believe that anything untoward had ever occurred there. The plantation operated with clockwork efficiency, its enslaved population worked with apparent contentment, and its facilities served as a model for progressive plantation management. The screams that had once echoed from the barn had been replaced by the quiet efficiency of scientific human processing. Thomas often stood on the gallery where he had first met Lucian, looking out over the avenue of oaks that had given the plantation its name. The trees remained unchanged, their ancient branches still forming a cathedral of green that filtered the Louisiana sun into dancing patterns of light and shadow. But everything else had been transformed beyond recognition. The man who had once been horrified by the sight of human suffering now felt only professional satisfaction when he reviewed the monthly reports from Circle facilities. The journalist who had once sought to expose injustice now devoted his considerable talents to concealing it behind layers of legal protection, scientific justification, and religious sanctification. The transformation was so complete that Thomas could barely remember the person he had once been. The idealistic young man who had arrived at Oak Alley seeking truth seemed like a character from a half-remembered dream, someone he might have read about in a book rather than actually been. As he prepared his final report on the success of the Great Ordering, Thomas reflected on what they had accomplished. They had not simply created a criminal organization or even a political movement. They had fundamentally altered the nature of American society. They had proven that human nature itself was malleable, that entire populations could be conditioned to accept their own degradation, and that systematic evil could be made to appear not just normal, but virtuous. The legacy of Oak Alley would endure long after the plantation itself had crumbled into dust. The techniques developed there would spread throughout the world. The philosophy pioneered there would influence generations of leaders, and the vision of perfect social order first articulated there would continue to shape human civilization for centuries to come. In his final entry in the Oak Alley records, Thomas wrote, "We have achieved something unprecedented in human history. We have created a system of oppression so complete, so sophisticated, and so thoroughly integrated into the fabric of society that it has become invisible to those it oppresses. Our victims do not merely submit to their degradation, they embrace it, celebrate it, and defend it against any who would seek to free them. We have not simply conquered bodies or even minds, we have conquered souls." The avenue of oaks stood silent in the Louisiana twilight, their ancient branches bearing witness to the transformation of a nation. The beauty that had once concealed horror now concealed something far worse, the systematic normalization of that horror, its transformation from crime into virtue, from aberration into natural law. The most terrifying legacy of Oak Alley was not the suffering it had caused, but the precedent it had established. It had proven that any atrocity could be made acceptable through the proper application of law, science, and religion. It had demonstrated that human beings could be conditioned to accept any degradation as natural and inevitable. Most importantly, it had shown that evil could triumph not through force alone, but through the far more insidious method of making itself appear virtuous. As the sun set behind the Mississippi River, casting long shadows across the plantation grounds, the true horror of Oak Alley was not what had happened there, but what it had made possible everywhere else. The techniques pioneered in that black-windowed barn had spread throughout the world, and the philosophy first articulated on that gallery had become the foundation of a new form of civilization, one built on the systematic destruction of human dignity and the celebration of that destruction as progress. The oaks would continue to stand, their beauty unchanged, their silence eternal. But the seeds of horror they had sheltered had already taken root throughout the world, growing into a forest of systematic oppression that would cast its shadow over human civilization for generations to come.